I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind, Lord, set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah.
Hello there, guys. Today we're here to talk about two of the major entities that had an effect on the outcome of the civil rights movement. The two entities would be the civil rights activists or grassroots activists and the reformers, which would include politicians, presidents, and anyone of that sort. It is first important to break down each of these groups as they were both made up of several voices, opinions, and just even conflicting views within the two entities. When we think about civil rights activists, the first group of people that usually come to mind are those who follow the ideologies of Martin Luther King. These are people who took on peaceful tactics rather than more violent ones such as rioting in order to get their point across and achieve the goal that they're after. Some examples of these peaceful tactics would include sit-ins. As you can see in the picture above, we have the people who participated in the Greensboro sit-ins. Another example would include peace marches. People were often seen cooperating together regardless of their color in order to achieve this goal. Martin Luther King knew that the only way to achieve their goals would be to transform the hearts of those who are in power. The other group of people who made up the activists were those who subscribed to the ideologies of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a black Muslim who often pointed at the problems that the current civil rights movement had. He believed that the civil rights movement failed to alleviate issues that often left blacks in poverty, jobless, and dealing with police brutality. Another group that would also fall into this category would be those in the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party was a more militant take on civil rights. Things that this party believed in included the ability to determine the destiny of the black community. They also made claims that the government was racist and had been robbing them for over decades. They even demanded 40 acres and 2 mules that had been promised to them 100 years ago as reinstitution for slave labor and mass murder of black people. They drew comparisons between the Germans aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people in the World War II. They felt that if Germany could do that, then the American people could do the same for the black community. However, people outside of the Black Panther Party often ended up comparing them to the KKK, as if they were the black equivalent of the group. The cartoon above demonstrates that, having coined the term Black Power as a response to white power, it almost makes perfect sense. As you can see, these are the two main groups that make up the civil rights activist movement. As you can see, the ideologies are pretty much polar opposites, but the goals of each group are ultimately the same. They wanted equality and freedom for the black community. Now moving on to the next entity, the civil rights reformers. As we said before, this included politicians, presidents, and those in power cooperating with these activist groups. An important figure to look at is LBJ. LBJ was a supporter of Martin Luther King and his cause, and even considered him a friend. However, even LBJ couldn't throw his politics out the window. He often found himself very carefully balancing his actions and words in order to not lose support from either side of the Democratic spectrum. In other words, he wanted to make sure to not upset Southern Democrats too much, as even they were a key part of the Democratic base. However, we're just talking about LBJ here. Similarly to the last group, the reformers were deeply divided as well. The only difference is that while the last entity was divided in the methods of which they accomplished the same goal, this entity is divided in the fact that they don't even want the same thing. it is very clear that there is a divide between the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats. However, even amongst those who were opposed to civil rights legislation had different motivations for which they opposed it. While it is very clear that there are some purely racist motivations behind, such as the literacy test, which some political cartoons even cleverly demonstrated at how ridiculous the literacy test was, and even implied that those pushing for the literacy test were the ones who needed it themselves. Another point raised included the usage of tax dollars in order to provide buses for black children who were now required to go to the desegregated schools. While some may argue that their main concern here is the usage of tax dollars, you can still see how racism could have been the true motivator here. All in all, we can see now that the two entities operated very differently, and obviously they each had their internal conflicts, which no doubt affected the relationship between the two entities. However, if we're going to talk about which entity was more responsible for the civil rights reform, we're going to have to say that the activists here were the true causation of the reform. Even though none of this could have been possible without the politicians and the president, the activists merely used them as a vehicle in order to get what they needed to accomplish done. At the end of the day, regardless of LBJ's true intentions, his job is to the American people. And at this time in America, the voice of the people was very polarizing. In order to remain in office and in order to continue to do good, LBJ had to maneuver these waters very carefully. However, had the activists never spoke up and had never said anything, then who knows if LBJ would have ever taken it upon himself to start this reform. Anyways guys, that about wraps it up for the video. Thank you for watching and I hope you enjoyed.